Developers do not want you to see this video because the 13 towns I'm about to show you are the ones the rest of the South paved over, forgot about, and left exactly where they were. See, there's a version of South Carolina that nobody talks about anymore. The version where the hardware store still has the same worn wooden floor it had in 1962, where the drugstore soda fountain never got ripped out, and where the loudest sound on Main Street at noon is a screen door slapping shut behind somebody who's in no particular hurry. I spent months driving the back roads of this state, past the interstate exits and the outlet malls, into the little courthouse towns and mill villages that simply stopped changing somewhere around the Kennedy administration and never bothered to start again. And what I found was a town where the clock on the square has been ticking without stopping since 1837, a working police station the size of a backyard tool shed, a patch of ground whose legal owner is listed in the county records as God Almighty, and an opera house that has been raising the curtain on live shows since 1908 and still does it tonight. If a slower, older, cheaper version of America sounds better to you than another roundabout and another brand new Dollar General, hit that subscribe button right now because we are counting down 13 South Carolina towns that got frozen in the 1960s and never moved on. Let's count it down. Number 13, Society Hill. When I first drove into Society Hill, I honestly thought my GPS had made a mistake, because a town whose name promises grandeur turns out to be about 400 people and a handful of old buildings sitting quietly in Darlington County up in the PED. But that quiet is the whole point. 200 years ago, this was one of the most important places in the entire region. It sits on land the Welsh Baptists settled, and it takes its name from the St. David Society, an old educational group. In 1812, they built a lending library here, and it still stands as the second oldest library of its kind in South Carolina. This tiny place educated men like James Lyde Coker, who went on to found the paper giant Sunoco and the college that carries his name. Then the rivers stopped mattering for shipping. The railroads and the highways went to Cheraw and Hartsville instead, and Society Hill just stopped growing. The population has actually shrunk from around 800 in 1980 to barely over 400 today. What that leaves you with is a whole historic district listed on the National Register back in 1974, where the old academy, the churches, and the antebellum homes still stand along streets almost nobody drives fast on. There is no supermarket, no stoplight rush, no sprawl. If you want specialist medical care, you're driving 20+ minutes to Hartsville, and that's the honest trade-off. But that's also why the old houses here are so cheap. You can still find a solid antebellum era home in this district for a fraction of what a new build costs an hour up the road. If you've ever wanted to live inside a page of a history book, this little town has been holding that page open for 2 centuries, and it is not charging much admission. Number 12, Denmark. Denmark started its life as a spot on a map called Graham's Turnout, which is exactly what it sounds like, a place where the railroad turned around. They later renamed it after a railroad official named B.A. Denmark, and to this day, the town's whole shape is drawn by those tracks. The old Denmark depot still stands downtown, and here's the part that gives me chills: a train still stops. Amtrak's Floridian rolls through this Bamberg County town of about 3,000 people every single day, the way trains used to stop in every small town in America before they didn't. But the reason I tell you to slow down in Denmark is a building on the main drag called the Jim Harrison Gallery. Harrison was a folk artist who made his name painting the exact America this whole video is about. Faded Coca-Cola signs on the sides of brick stores, tin-roofed country gas stations, tobacco barns, general stores with a dog asleep on the porch. He painted the vanishing South, and he did it from right here in Denmark, so the town is essentially a living version of his own paintings. It's also home to Voorhees University, one of South Carolina's historically black colleges, whose campus is a registered historic district. Now the honest part. Denmark has struggled economically for a long time, poverty is high, and the storefronts aren't all full. This is not a wealthy town pretending to be quaint. It is a real place that time and the highway system left behind, and it wears that plainly. But if you want to understand what rural South Carolina actually looked like 50 years ago, few places show you more directly. Number 11, Pelzer. If you want to stand in the exact spot where the modern South got wired for electricity, you drive to Pelzer, a mill town of barely 1,300 people down in Anderson County. Because Pelzer is not just an old mill village, it is arguably the mill village. A man named Ellison Adger Smith finished the first mill here in 1882, and this factory became the first in the entire country to light its floors with incandescent bulbs. It ran on the very first generators General Electric ever sold. Think about that. Farmers in this county were still using oil lamps in the house, while the mill down the road glowed all night like something from the future. Smith's upper mill was the first in South Carolina to be powered from a separate station over transmission lines, which is the whole idea we still run the power grid on. For a century, the mills defined every rhythm of life here. When Gerber, the baby food company, finally shut down the last of the operations in 1990, the heart of the town more or less stopped beating with it. The grand upper mill was torn down in 2004, and fires took chunks of the lower mill in 2012 and again in 2014. But the mill village itself is still here, street after street of those tidy, near-identical company houses where the workers lived, laid out on a plan that hasn't changed in over 100 years, a local historical society formed to save what's left. Walk those streets today, and it is astonishingly easy to picture the whistle blowing and the whole town walking to work at once. Number 10, Ware Shoals. Ware Shoals is what happens when a company builds an entire town from scratch and then decades later walks away. Benjamin Regal came to the Saluda River in 1902, put up a power plant, and then built a state-of-the-art textile mill around it and a whole town to serve the mill. And this was no crude camp. The company gave the place electric lights, running water, sewer, paved streets, a bank, an ice factory, even a $40,000 community center. By the 1960s, the mill employed around 5,000 people. Sit with that number for a second, because the entire town today holds about 1,700. When the textile business collapsed across the Carolinas and the mill wound down in the 1980s, Ware Shoals didn't get a replacement. It just got smaller and quieter. What's left is a genuine time capsule spread across 3 counties, Greenwood, Abbeville, and Lawrence. The Ware Shoals High School building, put up in 1926, is still one of the oldest schoolhouses still in use in the whole state. The old Ware Shoals Inn made the National Register in 2007, and every year the town throws a festival called the Catfish Feastival, which is exactly the kind of small town event that vanished from most of America 30 years ago. The stores aren't all occupied, and there's no pretending the boom is coming back. But you can buy a solid old house here for a fraction of what it costs an hour away in Greenville, and you can walk a downtown that a mill baron laid out in 1902, essentially the way he left it. Number 9, Hawnea Path. Some towns are frozen in time because nothing bad ever happened. Hawnea Path is frozen because something did, and for 60 years nobody would talk about it. This Anderson County town of about 3,600 grew up around the Chicquola Mill, and on the morning of September 6, 1934, that mill became the site of one of the worst days in South Carolina labor history. Workers across the country were part of a general textile strike, and when picketers gathered at the gate here, men loyal to the mill's management opened fire. 6 people were killed and roughly 30 were wounded. Many of the dead were found shot in the back, meaning they were running away. It became known as the Chicquola Mill Massacre, and the town simply did not speak of it. For 6 decades, there was no memorial, no marker, just silence hanging over Main Street. It took a PBS documentary called The Uprising of 1934 to finally pull the story into the light, and only then did the town put up a monument to its own dead. I tell you all of this not to sell you the place, but because you cannot understand the stillness of Hawnea Path without it. This is a town that got stuck in a moment and carried it quietly for generations. The mill is gone now, the village houses remain, and the memorial stands where the gate once did. It is one of the most sobering and most honest small towns you will find in this state. If you are learning things about South Carolina you never expected, hit that subscribe button. I cover the best and the strangest and the most forgotten places to live in America every single week. And trust me, this list only gets wilder from here. Number 8, Blackville. In Barnwell County, on a small patch of ground outside the town of Blackville, there is a plot of land whose legal, deeded owner is God. Not a church, not a diocese, not a foundation. God Almighty, written right there in the county records. The place is called God's Acre Healing Springs, and the story goes back to 1781, when 4 wounded Tory soldiers were left behind to die near here after a Revolutionary War skirmish. As the legend has it, Native Americans found them and carried them to a secret spring, and 6 months later, all of them walked back to Charleston alive and healthy. People have believed in the water ever since. In 1944, a man named L.P. Boylston formally deeded the land to God so that no person could ever own it or charge for it. And that is exactly how it works to this day. You drive up, you fill your jug straight from the pipes, and you pay nothing because you cannot buy what belongs to the Almighty. On any given weekend, you'll see people loading up dozens of containers of the stuff, cars with tags from 3 states over. The town of Blackville itself, a railroad town of under 2,000 named for a railroad promoter, moves at the same unbothered pace it has for generations, right down to a beloved country restaurant that folks drive an hour to reach. Nothing about this place is trying to impress you. It's just been quietly doing the same thing in the same spot for longer than most of America has existed. Number 7, Chester. Chester sits up on a hill in the state's old mill country, and its downtown is built around something they simply call the Hill, a steep brick-lined square crowned by a courthouse that dates to 1852 and an honest-to-goodness opera house. Stand up there and the whole town rolls away below you in a way that hasn't changed in well over a century. Chester is a county seat of about 5,300 people, and it has one of the odder historical footnotes in the state. Back in 1807, when former Vice President Aaron Burr was being hauled across the country to stand trial for treason, his guards stopped in Chester. Burr, seeing a crowd, threw himself off his horse and cried out for someone to rescue him. It didn't work, they wrestled him back into the saddle, but the stone he supposedly leapt onto is still preserved right in the middle of town, and locals call it the Aaron Burr Rock. Like most towns up here, Chester was built on cotton and textiles, and like most of them, it got hit hard when that industry pulled out of the Carolinas in the late 20th century. That's the strange gift of these mill towns. The very collapse that hurt them is what preserved them. Chester Square looks the way it does precisely because prosperity moved on and left the 1900s standing right where they were. Number 6, Great Falls. Great Falls might be the purest ghost of the textile South on this entire list. For most of the 20th century, this Chester County town lived and breathed by the Republic cotton mills. Construction started in 1909. The first mill opened in 1911 with 175 workers, and the company built the whole town around it, the streets, the houses, a company store, even a pharmacy. In 1948, it merged into the textile giant J.P. Stevens, which employed most of the town for decades. And then in the early 1980s, all 3 mills shut their doors, and Great Falls fell into a silence it's still climbing out of. The population today is under 2,000. The old Republic Theater, where mill families once spent their Saturday nights, still stands and sits on the National Register. But here's the twist that makes Great Falls fascinating right now. This town sits on the Catawba River in the middle of one of the oldest hydroelectric systems in America, dams that Duke Energy's ancestor company started building back in 1905. For 100 years, those dams held the river back and left the falls bone dry. Recently, the power company began releasing water again, and the rapids have come roaring back to life, drawing whitewater paddlers to a town that markets itself now as the place where the river runs wild. So you have this rare thing, a genuine 1960s mill town frozen by economic collapse, slowly being rediscovered because the river it was built on finally got to flow again. Number 5, Bishopville. Bishopville is proof that being frozen in time does not have to mean being boring. This Lee County seat of about 3,000 people is home to the South Carolina Cotton Museum, which tells the story of the crop that built this whole region, and I am not making this up, displays the world's largest boll weevil. But the museum is just the start. Bishopville was the home of Dalton Stevens, the self-proclaimed Button King. A man who couldn't sleep, so he sewed buttons onto things, and I mean everything. a suit with something like 16,000 buttons on it, a button-covered car, a button-covered coffin, and a button-covered guitar. Then there's Pearl Fryer, a man with no formal training who turned 3 acres of his yard into a topiary garden so extraordinary that it drew national attention and put this little town on the art world map. And I haven't even mentioned the Lizard Man. In 1988, this area became famous nationwide when people reported a 7-foot reptilian creature in the Scape Ore Swamp, supposedly scratching up cars, and the town leaned all the way into the legend. Anchoring all of it is a proper courthouse square with a courthouse finished in 1902 and a small downtown of low brick storefronts that looks much the way it did when cotton was king and everybody's paycheck came out of the fields around it. What makes Bishopville feel frozen isn't decay, it's the fact that its whole character was set by these gloriously eccentric homegrown obsessions: cotton, buttons, topiary, and a swamp monster, and the town never felt the need to sand any of it down into something more modern. Number 4. Cheraw. Cheraw calls itself the prettiest town in Dixie, and after driving through a lot of South Carolina, I understand the confidence. This is one of the oldest towns in the state, and it was laid out in colonial days around a genuine village green, a wide open square of grass with old cannons on it. The kind of layout you almost never see in America. That green anchors one of the best preserved historic districts in South Carolina, block after block of homes and churches and storefronts that go back well over 200 years, including Old St. David's Church, the last Anglican church built in the colony under the British Crown. Right on the green sits the Theater on the Green, an old movie house that still hosts performances. But Cheraw's greatest export walked out of these very streets. In 1917, John Burks Gillespie was born here, the man the world would come to know as Dizzy Gillespie, one of the founding fathers of bebop and one of the most important musicians of the 20th century. There's a statue of him on the green now, horn tilted up the way he played it. What gets me about Cheraw is how gently everything coexists. A colonial green, a Revolutionary-era church, a small-town movie theater, and the birthplace of a jazz legend, all within a few blocks, all still standing, all still used. This is a Chesterfield County town of about 5,000 that had every reason to modernize itself into anonymity and simply chose not to. If you've made it this far, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who are trying to find the last few places in America that still feel like home. Number 3, Ridgeway. In the town of Ridgeway in Fairfield County, there is a police station that measures 10 feet by 12. That is not a typo. The whole building is smaller than a lot of people's bedrooms, and for years it was billed as the world's smallest police station. It started life in the 1890s as a well house, built to water the mules of local farmers, and in 1940 the town restored the little brick structure and turned it into police headquarters. Officers actually worked out of it for a town of around 300 people until 1990, when they finally built a normal-sized station right next door. The tiny one still stands, and it is genuinely charming in a way that no modern building will ever be. But the police station is just the headline. All of Ridgeway is a nearly intact turn-of-the-century town. Most of its buildings put up between 1890 and 1915, back when this stretch of the state was booming on cotton and the railroad ran straight through the middle of everything. The commercial district is a run of 2-story brick stores, and the neighborhoods around it are full of Victorian and bungalow homes on quiet, shaded streets. There's an old cotton gin and a depot. The whole place is laid out in a long line along where the tracks ran, the way railroad towns were, because that's exactly what it was. And it's close enough to Columbia, roughly half an hour south, that you can vanish into this pocket of 1910 and still reach a real hospital and a real airport when you need one, which is not a small thing when you're planning a retirement. Ridgeway didn't preserve itself on purpose so much as it just never had a reason to tear anything down, and the result is a town that feels like you drove through a hole in the calendar. Number 2, Abbeville. Abbeville is the crown jewel of the South Carolina courthouse town, and it earns the number 2 spot because it is both beautiful and heavy with history. The heart of it is Court Square, a genuine town square wrapped in old brick storefronts, anchored on one side by the county courthouse and on another by the Abbeville Opera House. And that Opera House is the thing that stops you cold. It opened in 1908 in the golden age of vaudeville when touring shows rolled through by rail, and here is the miracle: it never closed for good. It has hosted live theater on that stage on and off for well over a century, and it still raises the curtain today. You can buy a ticket and watch a play in a room where audiences sat before the First World War. But Abbeville carries an even weightier title. They call it the birthplace and the deathbed of the Confederacy. On a rise they call Secession Hill. One of the first mass meetings pushing South Carolina to leave the Union was held in 1860. And then at the Burt Stark Mansion right here in town, Jefferson Davis held the last meeting of his Confederate cabinet on May 2, 1865, and effectively acknowledged the war was lost. So the whole thing, the beginning and the end, bookends in one small upstate town of under 5,000 people. Add in the historic Belmont Inn, the brick streets, and the storefronts around the square, and you get a place where you can stand in one spot and see 160 years of American history that nobody ever paved over. Abbeville didn't move on. It kept the whole story standing. Number 1, Winnsboro. And this brings us to the town that more than any other simply refused to let time pass. Winnsboro is the seat of Fairfield County, about 3,200 people, and in the middle of its main street stands the reason it takes the top spot on this list. It's called the Town Clock, and it was built in 1837. It is billed as the oldest continuously running town clock in the United States, and I want you to really hear that word, continuously. This clock has been ticking and chiming and keeping the time over the same street for nearly 200 years. Through the Civil War, when Sherman's troops came through and burned much of the county, the clock kept time. Through the rise and the collapse of the textile mills, it kept time. Through every decade that hollowed out small-town America, it just kept ticking, right there on Main Street, the way it always has. And the town beneath it matches. Winnsboro grew up on cotton, and it had a cotton mill that was so much a part of daily life it inspired an actual folk song, the Winnsboro Cotton Mill Blues, later recorded by legends like Lead Belly and Pete Seeger. That mill eventually converted over to making tires, and the industry has come and gone, but the historic district downtown still stands, low brick buildings lining a street that the clock has watched over since before the Alamo fell. That's why Winnsboro is number 1. Most of these towns feel frozen in time. Winnsboro has an actual machine on Main Street that has been measuring time without stopping for the better part of 2 centuries in a town that never once felt the need to move on. So that's the list. 13 South Carolina towns that the interstate skipped, that the developers forgot, and that simply decided somewhere back around 1962 that they liked things the way they were. None of them are famous. None of them have billboards on I-95 or a stadium with their name on it, but every single one of them has held on to something the big cities traded away a long time ago. A main street you can walk, a history you can touch, a pace where a stranger might actually stop and talk to you, and a cost of living that won't eat a fixed income alive. And South Carolina makes that easier than you'd think because it doesn't tax your Social Security at all and gives retirees a real break on the rest. If this video made you want to go find a town that still feels like home, subscribe to the channel because I go looking for places like these every single week. The forgotten ones, the cheap ones, the ones the brochures leave out. Now, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me which one of these 13 you'd actually pack up and move to. I'll see you in the next one.